One of the world's greatest mountain ranges, the Coast Mountains of Western British Columbia span an area of approximately 300,000 square kilometers. Our story about the exploration and preservation of the Coast Mountains begins with the native inhabitants of the West Coast. It is clear that many of the more accessible passes and summits were visited regularly by First Nations hunters and gatherers. Ancient trade trails weaved from seashore into the alpine. Necessity bred exploration, not a desire to climb mountains. The earliest exploration of the Coast Mountains by Europeans was sporadic. Trappers and prospectors made forays into unmapped areas throughout the 18th and 19th centuries. Although remarkable journeys were achieved, no one exhibited an interest in climbing peaks that were better avoided than confronted. It is generally accepted that the birth of mountaineering on the coast was sparked not by climbers in search of peaks, but by North Shore hunters in search of game. Typical of such an ascent was the first recorded ascent of Vancouver's West Lion, known by local natives before settlement as the Two Sisters. At 4 a.m. in July 1889, legendary chief Joe Capilano and two native companions began a hunting foray from a beach encampment on Howe Sound. The party included a paying client, Dr. Henry Bell Irving, who was known to enjoy climbing for climbing's sake. At the end of the day, it was the stubborn pursuit of mountain goats that forced Bell Irving to follow his native guides to the summit of the West Lion, where he claimed the first recorded ascent. The ascent of the West Lion by Bell Irving slowly became known. The North Shore peaks took on a new allure. Hiking up local mountains for the sheer pleasure of experiencing the delights of the alpine became less bohemian. The freedom of the North Shore hills was catching on. Increasing numbers of mountain ramblers trekked up the Grouse Mountain Trail. A new cult of mountain folk slowly formed, and key individuals emerged to shape the future of mountaineering on the coast. By autumn 1906, a small corps of keen mountaineers realized the need for a permanent weather-resistant shelter on the Grouse Plateau. One such enthusiast was Manfred Mills.
In the late summer of 1906, we decided to continue our exploring through the coming fall and winter, also to make a base for hunting the large amount of big game which we had seen during our trips. For these purposes, a cabin was built. This cabin was located in the midst of a fine stand of primeval forest. We named it the Red Shack.
The Red Shack was a focal point for like-minded individuals who came together through similar goals and ambitions. Knowledge of the local mountains was pooled. The Red Shack was a staging area for group outings and social events, including Christmas dinners. Songs were sung and satirical skits were performed to entertain celebratory gatherings. Mountain culture had arrived in the Coast Mountains. For many years, the mysterious peaks north of Vancouver beckoned to ambitious adventurers. One mountain dominated. Its summit was thought to be well over 3,000 meters above sea level. The mountain was known by First Nations as Tsikai, meaning dirty snow. Newer arrivals called it Mount Garibaldi, a name given by a British sea captain in 1860 after an admired Italian patriot, Giuseppe Garibaldi. Several unrecorded attempts to climb Mount Garibaldi in the early 1900s produced little result, barely cresting the tree line. The first recorded attempt came in July 1905, when T. Price, D. Gray, A. King, and A. Dalton failed to reach the summit due to dangerous snow conditions. Two years later, King and Dalton returned to the mountain with 4 others. The group of 6 mountaineers included Atwell King, A.T. Dalton, his son W.T. Dalton, G.B. Warren, T. Pattison, and J.J. Trory. In late July 1907, the climbers departed Vancouver aboard the steamer Britannia, en route for the tiny settlement of Newport, known today as Squamish. From Squamish, a spring wagon carried men and gear for nearly 20 kilometers along the Brackendale-Pemberton Meadows Wagon Road to its junction with the Chekai River. The men continued towards their objective on foot up the Chikai River drainage, and then into inevitable bush and steep wooded slopes. Within 2 days, a high camp was made on Crescent Ridge, known today as Brome Ridge. The days that followed brought showers of rain and wet snow. 2 aborted attempts on the summit were made. Morale was on the decline, and there was talk of giving up. Spurred onward by an adamant will to succeed, Atwell King and A.T. Dalton insisted on an all-out final effort.
In a kind of trance, we at last crawled up a ridge of soft, clean snow, and found ourselves standing on a flat, bare rock, with only the 4 winds about us and the heavens above us. One of our young guides planted a Union Jack, and we realized that a virgin peak was conquered.
King, Dalton and Son, Warren, Pattison and Trory succeeded in climbing Mount Garibaldi. Success on Mount Garibaldi was widely publicized. The event was a catalyst in the psyche of West Coast mountaineers. Mountain climbing was becoming popular enough to warrant the organization of a body to coordinate knowledge of local trails and to give the sport an official status. On October 28, 1907, under the chairmanship of Garibaldi summiteer J.J. Trory, a group of local mountaineers met and organized into the Vancouver Mountaineering Club, which soon enlarged its scope and changed its name to the British Columbia Mountaineering Club. Alongside J.J. Trory, 2 other Garibaldi summiteers were charter members, W. Dalton and Atwell King, the club's first treasurer. Soon after the inaugural meeting, the membership forged a constitution that has endured for a century. A crest was designed that featured popular peaks near Vancouver. The first elected president of the newly formed organization was J.C. Bishop, affectionately known as Pa. Pa Bishop was a man of smooth integrity who had risen to popularity naturally among North Shore regulars. On November 15, 1907, Pa Bishop formally raised the club pennant at the Hotel Capilano. The hotel was a popular staging area for club excursions. Bishop's presidency lasted for 3 formative years, until he became the club's first honorary president in 1910. President Bishop was the first to advocate the Mount Garibaldi area as a park reserve for future generations. From its inception, the British Columbia Mountaineering Club engendered a distinct equality between men and women. The first vice presidency was shared by George Edwards and Miss L. Laverock, a competent mountaineer in her own right. Perhaps even more than men, women found a rightful place among local mountains. They thrived on the new freedoms found within their beauty and adventure. Women expertly carried out leadership roles throughout the history of the club. The fledgling British Columbia Mountaineering Club swelled with a new tide of mountain ramblers who relished regular club meetings and socials. This was a congenial tribe that sought to embrace the natural world and distance itself from the emerging constraints of early city existence. The social framework of the new club created a medium for keen individuals to rise and shine. Manfred, or Fred, Mills was a well-known North Shore regular. He'd been involved with the building of the Red Shack and was a charter member of the club. Over many years, he received great acclaim as a route finder, especially from those newly baptized by Coast Mountain Bush. It seemed only logical that Fred Mills should be the BCMC's first director of excursions. No easy task, it rested upon the trip director to coordinate and, when necessary, lead large groups of mountaineers safely to and from their mountain objectives. In 1908, Mills' reputation as a climber of the highest standards became indisputable when he led the groundbreaking first ascent of the Camel, a block of vertical rock adjacent to the summit of Crown Mountain. The daunting feature was considered to be the most hazardous and technically difficult unclimbed peak near Vancouver. 1910 to 1912 were vital years within the BCMC. The summer of 1910 brought the first British Columbia Mountaineering Club summer camp, held at Round Mountain, near today's Heather Meadows, south of Mount Garibaldi. By now, the club had outgrown the minimalist red shack. In the spring of 1910, land was acquired on Grouse Mountain, and a new cabin was constructed by club members over just 7 weekends. Finishing work continued throughout the autumn and winter of 1910. A grand opening celebration took place in February 1911. Dinner was served and a melodrama was enacted that gave as much fun to the actors as to the audience. In 1912, one of Fred Mills' ardent young protégés was elected club president. Billy Gray was a shooting star. A charter member of the club, Billy Gray was diplomatic and energetic. He participated in many club first ascents. His contribution to the growth of local mountaineering was significant. Unfortunately, the one-room club cabin, built just 2 years earlier in 1910, lacked enough room for the steadily increasing club membership. Under Billy Gray's new presidency, a pitched roof was added. The renovation allowed separate sleeping quarters. Over several seasons of steady refinement, the clubhouse became a comfortable and attractive gathering place. Its walls echoed with tales of ambition, and, perhaps more importantly, song and laughter. 4-part harmonies enchanted listeners. The improved headquarters brought stability to the club. From the onset of coast mountaineering, a significant challenge was the serious void in accurate maps. President Billy Gray embarked on an extensive photographic and plane table survey work to produce the first Garibaldi area maps. In 1912, almost single-handedly, Gray blazed the first access trail from the Cheakamus Valley to Black Tusk Meadows, where the 3rd club camp was held that year. The BC Mountaineering Club was thriving. Members took great pride in their unprejudiced and democratic ways, chiming with satisfaction that climbing partners came from all walks of life and levels of income, all gentlemen and gentlewomen. The first annual BCMC publication arose from a vast accumulation of exploratory and scientific knowledge collected by the club. Entitled The Northern Cordilleran, the thickly bound journal contained as much information about living things and the need for conservation as it did about mountains and mountain climbing. By winter 1913, Fred Mills' career responsibilities with the Canadian Pacific Railroad had grown, and a new trip director was required. The task of stepping into Mills' large shoes was not an easy prospect, but no one was better suited to it than Tom Files. Files would emerge into prominence as the club's longest-serving trip director. World War I brought a noticeable decline of men within the club, since many of them enlisted. Women members kept the BCMC alive by embracing administrative duties and organizing weekly club outings. Miss E.B. Fowler was elected as the first woman trip director, having charge of the organization and guidance of mountain trips. The post-war period brought revitalization and momentum. Exploration of the local mountains continued with renewed zest. Throughout the 1920s, activities continued with increasing numbers and success. This was due mainly to trip director Tom Files. Tom Files was described as a mild-mannered climber. Files' first ascents number in the dozens. Solo first ascents included the north peak of Black Tusk, the Table, and, after 3 attempts over several years, the southwest peak of the remote Judge Howe. Eventually, club activities became so numerous that a committee replaced trip director duties. As the BCMC's longest-serving trip director, Tom Files inducted many young men and women into the challenges and rewards of the mountains. Neil Carter was just such an inductee. Carter joined the BCMC in 1920 at the age of 17. Within 4 years, he accomplished the first ascents of Wedge Mountain, Mount Turner, and Diavolo. But Carter's allegiance was always to the coast mountains of BC, where he undertook many ambitious projects, including an early expedition to the Lillooet icefield, and later a valiant attempt on Mount Waddington, where his friend Alec Dalgleish was killed. Carter matched his prolific mountaineering with a penchant for cartography. He refined Billy Gray's original map of the Garibaldi area and undertook mapping of the Tantalus Range. The 1920s continued significant effort by the BCMC to preserve the invaluable environs of Mount Garibaldi. For nearly 2 decades, the club held annual summer camps in the Black Tusk and Mount Garibaldi meadows, and assisted other groups, such as the Mazamas and the Seattle Mountaineers, to hold camps there. The strategy was to draw public attention towards protecting the entire area as a park. In 1926, a club camp of 83 people, to which the public was invited, rallied supporters to the Garibaldi cause, and the Garibaldi Park Act was legislated on March 7, 1927. The unflagging efforts of BCMC members had helped secure one of the most beautiful parks in the world. The end of the decade witnessed the 17-year-old Grouse Mountain cabin occupied beyond capacity. A larger cabin was designed and constructed not far below the old one in 1927. During winter months, skiers and snowshoers gravitated towards the less crowded rolling knolls of Mount Seymour. The BCMC undertook construction of a small hut on Mount Seymour's western slopes. The hut proved so popular that within 6 years, construction was undertaken on a much larger cabin higher up. The club had successfully diversified its interests and provided greater scope for members on Grouse Mountain and Mount Seymour. During the early 1930s, 2 club members gained notoriety within the mountaineering community. They clearly demonstrated an intense and complete dedication to their mountain way of life, and to each other. Phyllis and Don Munday can hardly be denied a rightful place as the best-known couple in the history of coast mountain exploration. Dawn had joined the BCMC in 1910. Shortly after immigrating with her family from Ceylon to Canada, Phyllis James spent several years in the mountains of the West Kootenays before moving to Vancouver. Dawn Munday met Phyllis James in 1918.
Then finally I met Don, and he was a climber, and I belonged to the BC Mountaineering Club at that time. We met quite often, of course, on their trips. Well, I was always keen on the out-of-doors, and you were never seen on the street with breeches in those days, so we'd wear a skirt over our breeches. And then when we got to the foot of the mountain or foot of the trail, wherever you happened to be, you took your skirt off.
In 1923, Dawn began a commitment to the BCMC as the first editor of a new monthly newsletter entitled The BC Mountaineer. By 1925, mountaineering in the Coast Mountains had been contained within a 100-mile radius of the city of Vancouver. Very little was known about the vast area of coastal peaks further north. During a pleasant lunch atop Vancouver Island's Mount Arrowsmith, a torch was lit by the sight of a distant giant. In Dawn's words, "The Monday's persistence of vision stayed clear. For nearly a decade, with the help of a small support group, the undaunted couple left daughter Edith with relatives or friends and obsessively attempted the peak known today as Mount Waddington, the highest mountain entirely within British Columbia and the only one over 4,000 meters high."
Well, we just went, first of all, in our rowboat up Night Inlet and cached the boat in the bush, and then Don built a gas boat in the basement, took the wall of the house out.
1928, on their third attempt, they succeeded by full moonlight in reaching the slightly lower northwest summit at dawn. They would reach this summit twice over the next 2 years, but the main summit continued to disallow their presence. Their persistent and heroic exploits are recorded in Dawn's book, Mystery Mountain. 1934 marked the end of the Monday's attempts on Mount Waddington. Finally, in 1936, Fritz Wiesner and Bill House forged a way to the main summit. Throughout the mid-30s, the golden age of coast mountain exploration on foot and on horseback was being slowly but surely supplemented by those willing to apply the benefits of the train and the combustion engine in its various manifestations. This rare archival footage from 1933 provides stirring evidence of a new revolution in coast mountain approaches. Near Vancouver, Garibaldi Lake was among the first to feel pontoons slice through her azure waters. A once multi-day objective was turned into a one-day outing. During the 1940s, the Mountain Emergency Squad organized to assist the RCMP and the BC Forest Service in general search and rescue. The operation attracted many BCMC members. In the 50s, the squad evolved into the Mountain Rescue Group, the predecessor of North Shore Search and Rescue. The British Columbia Mountaineering Club offered opportunities for mountain experiences further afield. Annual club excursions to the Rockies began as early as the 1920s. Throughout the decades, regular BCMC trips to the Rocky Mountains became routine. The 1950s and 60s ushered in a huge European influence to the coast mountains. Techniques and technology honed in France, Germany, New Zealand, and Switzerland brought new standards. New routes were accomplished up popular peaks as European focus envisioned lines of greater technical difficulty. The influx of European mountaineers brought a new wave of vitality to the coast mountains. These climbers harbored a deep love of mountains and relished the untracked wilds of their new home, the coast mountains. Two climbers who played a central role in the coast mountains during the 1960s were Esther and Martin Kafer. The Kafers arrived from Switzerland in 1958. The notion of unexplored mountains blossomed into a life of mutual wonder and adventure. They were two of the finest mountaineers in the Vancouver climbing community and showed their love and support of the sport by a lifetime involvement within the BC Mountaineering Club. In 2007, 100 years after the first ascent of Mount Garibaldi, a group of British Columbia Mountaineering Club members returned J.J. Trory's ice axe to the summit. Dressed in period clothing for the event, the climbers celebrated a century of British Columbia Mountaineering Club heritage. In the end, there are as many reasons why people climb as there are climbers.